The U.S. has rejected Iran's counterproposal to end the war, calling it totally unacceptable.
President Trump's rebuke comes after Iran responded to the latest American peace plan via Pakistani mediators. And state media said that that proposal stressed the need for a permanent end to the war on all fronts, especially Lebanon. It also called on the U.S. to lift sanctions on Iranian oil sales for 30 days and end its naval blockade of Iranian ports. Tehran reportedly demanded control over the Strait of Hormuz. If the U.S. took on certain commitments, it's unclear what they are. And on the nuclear issue, the Wall Street Journal reports Iran proposed diluting some of its highly enriched uranium with the remainder transferred to a third country.
Now, reacting on his Truth Social platform, Mr. Trump accused Tehran of playing games with the world for decades and warned it'll be, quote, laughing no longer. Well, separately, in an interview, the U.S. leader reiterated threats to resume attacks on Iran. That he claimed the U.S. needs 2 weeks to hit every target and that the country's military has been decimated. The U.S. envoy to the UN, Mike Waltz, however, insists the president is giving diplomacy every chance before resuming hostilities.
The diplomatic deadlock comes amid mounting tensions in the Mideast, with fresh drone attacks testing the fragile truce between the U.S. and Iran.
Now, the cargo ship was struck off Qatar on Sunday, sparking a fire on board. The Qatar's defense ministry said the vessel was arriving from Abu Dhabi when it was hit by a drone near the port of Mesaid. Doha stopped short of naming those responsible, but condemned the strike as a dangerous and unacceptable escalation. There's been no immediate claim of responsibility, though Iran's Fars News agency reported that the vessel was sailing under the U.S. flag. Now, Washington has yet to confirm this.
Well, the United Arab Emirates said it shot down 2 Iranian drones. Kuwait also said its defenses responded to hostile drones, but didn't say where they came from. And these incidents come after Iran threatened to target U.S. interests in the region if its tankers continue to come under attack.
A spokesperson for Iran's Parliamentary National Security Commission warned that Tehran's restraints is over. Additionally, Iran's military said the countries enforcing U.S. sanctions against Iran could face problems when their vessels transit the Strait of Hormuz. For more insight on the latest, let's speak now with Arran Kennedy. He's a maritime security analyst with Control Risks. He joins us right here in the studio. Good morning, Arran.
Good morning.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with your response to President Trump's rejection of Iran's proposal. Are we back to square one here?
It's not surprising here because the two sides' kind of core demands are so far apart. And amid these diplomatic negotiations being mediated by Pakistan, we also have 2 blockades. We have the US's naval blockade against Iran, and we, of course, have the Iran's blockade against all Strait of Hormuz shipping that it does not give permission to sail. So kind of with that backdrop, it's not surprising here that over the weekend we haven't seen any significant progress compared to really the past over 2 months.
But what we've seen, Arran, are fresh drone attacks over several Gulf countries. And that was, just yesterday, a barrage of that. What does that tell us about how Iran may be applying pressure beyond the strait itself?
So what both sides are doing amid this kind of onshore ceasefire since mid-April is both sides are kind of recalibrating or really increasing their threshold for what constitutes a breach of that ceasefire. So, of course, last week we saw drone strikes against Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. Likewise, we've seen certain US strikes on Iran in a kind of limited, calibrated way. So do I think these drone strikes in and of themselves will result in a complete rupture of the ceasefire? No, I don't. But nevertheless, it shows that there is a risk here that this kind of lower level Iranian pushback will sort of accumulate, and actually Washington in turn is kind of forced to reassert credibility by essentially kind of the ceasefire ending, and we see that kind of return to full-scale hostilities that we saw between late February and mid-April.
Okay, and we're also hearing more discussions about international naval mission to safeguard and secure the strait. Is that feasible without sort of significant military presence in the strait?
No, it's not feasible without that presence. And the vast majority of countries do not want to partake in such a naval coalition. Why? Well, some are simply uninterested, others lack the firepower, and others do not want to distract any firepower they do have from other missions. Bear in mind, any naval forces operating in the Strait do so at very high risk of both asset losses, but also the sailors on board. And because bear in mind, they have to protect themselves, but also the commercial ships that they're seeking to bring through the Strait. And we saw this last week when the US announced what it called Project Freedom. 2 destroyers managed to get 2 US flagships out of the Gulf, but then that project was immediately put on pause. During that transit, Iran launched multiple barrages of missiles and drones and other weaponry against those ships. And what that really underlined is what we've known all along, which is that any vessel seeking to sail the Strait without Iran's permission will be targeted by Iran. And it's kind of in that context that most countries do not want to put their assets at risk. Bear in mind, Iran has spent essentially decades designing this naval system precisely for this scenario, and kind of we're seeing it being used right now. And yes, in that context, I'm not surprised at all that there's reluctance for other states, including the US, I might add, to kind of implement such a naval system.
Yeah, warnings, of course, to the British and the French warships as well, should they decide to move into the Strait. Can you dive a little deeper, Arran, into the risk picture for commercial shipping if more foreign forces get involved?
So the risk picture is unlikely to be any different than it has in the past 2 months, which is ships face an extreme risk of total loss of the ship itself, also any cargo that's being transported, but also the crews, most importantly, the crews that are on board those vessels. As I say, there are many ships now that having been trapped in the Gulf for 2 months, they're not just going to suddenly leave. They're going to want detailed guidance by naval forces, the US and others, about how they can avail themselves of protection before they leave. But as I said just a moment ago, it's the kind of prospects for that kind of multinational coalition are not particularly good.
But every now and then a ship gets to go through. Over the weekend, we had the successful clearance of a Qatari LNG carrier, also a ship, a bulk carrier that was bound for Brazil. Does this suggest to you that Iran is trying to control the flow of vessels rather than shut it completely?
That's what it's been doing for the past kind of 6 or so weeks. So what typically happened is there was a kind of usual shipping lane that ships would use to go in and out of the Strait. Iran has shut that shipping lane down and has instead established its own shipping lane further north. And ships have have managed to leave the Gulf and in very few cases enter the Gulf, either as a result of diplomatic negotiations. So in the case of the Qatari LNG carrier, it's perfectly possible that in fact there was some kind of agreement between Doha and Tehran. And in other cases, vessels have left as a result of paying a toll to Iran. But bear in mind, if you pay a toll to the IRGC, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization, you face a very high risk of breaching sanctions. So this is, as I say, a kind of continuation of the status quo, which is Iran seeking to dictate which vessels can enter and exit the Gulf.
Okay. And Arran, and even if tensions ease from here, I think it's safe to say that Strait of Hormuz may never be viewed the same way again. What kind of precedent does this set for in a global shipping? What sort of key lessons can shipping companies, insurers, and energy markets learn from this?
So you're absolutely right. Everything Iran is saying and doing is signaling that it intends, or at least it wants to, exercise kind of longer-term control over the Strait. So first of all, it's establishing the kind of domestic, legal and regulatory framework to exercise control of the Strait. Last week, it sent out essentially a checklist for ship owners and operators that had to be filled out before they could get quote-unquote permission from Iran. It's also the Strait, as we've discussed, is kind of really at the center of these negotiations with the US and Iran. And also, if you look at Iranian propaganda that previously showed missiles and drones now show the Strait of Hormuz. So kind of embedding in the kind of this idea of permanent control. What does it tell us more broadly? Well, it tells us what kind of people like me are spending every day looking at, which is these shipping choke points that states can use their kind of proximity to exercise leverage over other states, and shipping is essentially kind of a bargaining chip in these negotiations, and just generally in kind of geopolitical affairs. More broadly, do I think we're going to suddenly start to see every shipping choke point tolled in a way that Iran is attempting to do in the Strait? No, I don't. But nevertheless, shipping will be caught up through kind of attacks, whether overt or covert, seizures, specific disruptions, harassment. All of these kind of ways to disrupt specific trades are really going to increase globally. And this current pattern in the Strait of Hormuz is really kind of, I think certain states will be taking lessons from what Iran is doing.
You know, Arran, China's been entering this story a little more intensely ahead of the Trump-Xi meeting later this week.
Yeah.
And the President Trump, that is, reportedly wants this situation sorted before his China visit. How does that shape the timeline around Hormuz, you think?
I don't think it's definitive. China does play a role here, but it's typically through the kind of diplomatic pressure it's going to place on both Iran but also the US. Because bear in mind, yes, China does get oil from Iran, and of course the US's naval blockade here is disrupting those flows. But at the same time, the majority of Chinese imports are actually from the Gulf states, and Iran is blocking those shipments. So China is a factor, but it's not the factor in these negotiations.
Okay, Arran, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for coming in and for expertise today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've been speaking to Arran Kennedy, a maritime security analyst with Control Risks.